Well, following that broadcast, Lindsay Perigo's bosses, who were huddled in an office, said something like, "It wasn't real, was it?" Reached for the gin and banned him from appearing in the opinion slot ever again. Now, a little later that year, a drunken Sir Robert Muldoon went on television to announce a snap election. I don't know if you have that expression here, but it simply means an election held ahead of time. The economy was reaching crisis point. Muldoon's majority in Parliament was precarious. The country was sick of him, and he knew it. When the election was held on July 14, his government was soundly defeated by the Labour Party under the leadership of David Lange. Now, Labour supporters were probably hoping for a continuation of Muldoon's Keynesian approach, but they hadn't counted on Labour's Minister of Finance, Roger Douglas. Now, Douglas was no philosopher and no free marketeer, if it comes to that, but he had long since come to the realisation that when the government tried to run things, it routinely screwed up. His goal was to get the government out of areas where it had demonstrably screwed up, reform the tax system so that it wasn't such a disincentive for people to work, and at the end of the day, deliver a more efficient, streamlined welfare state. The idea of abolishing the welfare state altogether was, and is to this day, anathema to him. Douglas was heavily influenced and supported by a small group of businessmen and Treasury officials who had, in turn, been influenced by the writings of our friend Professor Hayek. Economics was the fundamental thing in life in the eyes of these people. They had no time for, indeed were openly contemptuous of, any discussion about moral and philosophical underpinnings. "It's all too theoretical," Roger Douglas said to me one night. The more philosophical among them might say, if pressed, that what drove them was the greatest good of the greatest number, but they wouldn't want to linger for a discussion about it. Roger Douglas pursued his agenda with an energy and speed that left his opponents dumbstruck. He has since identified his strategy as, give them so many moving targets they won't know which one to shoot at. The wage, price, rent, interest rate, exchange rate controls remaining from the Muldoon era were abolished. Farming subsidies were wiped out in one stroke. The top rate of income tax was cut in half from 66 cents in the dollar to 33. And a new standardized indirect tax regime called the Goods and Services Tax, set at 10%, was introduced. Government departments that ran all the industries I mentioned before were corporatized, that is, made to run on a commercial footing as an interim step to privatization, which in some instances only subsequently occurred. Thousands of unnecessary jobs were shed from these departments and industries. One of the Hayekian businessmen I spoke of earlier said that the laid-off workers were being set free to do something useful for once in their lives. Unemployment skyrocketed, meaning a corresponding increase in dole payments. The one fatal flaw in the Douglas strategy, philosophical motivation aside, was not of his making. Because the Labour Party had such close ties to the union movement and was financially dependent on it, the Labour government could not deregulate the labour market for fear of its financial lifeline being cut. The one thing that needed doing most was left undone. Compulsory unionism and centralised bargaining gave unions the artificial muscle to force wage rises utterly unrelated to productivity on employers and on an economy unable to sustain them. Inflation roared away again. Interest rates roared away as the country's central bank, the Reserve Bank, tried to bring inflation under control. Businesses went to the wall. But such was the sense of purpose and high resolve that Douglas and Lange jointly brought to the selling of the reform process that the Labour government was re-elected in 1987 with an even bigger majority, notwithstanding the widespread pain that the reforms had inflicted. And Douglas pressed on. At a press conference in December 1987, flanked by the Prime Minister and leading members of the Cabinet, he announced his intention of introducing a comprehensive new package of reforms, including a flat rate of income tax and the streamlining of the welfare system. Astute observers noted at the time that Prime Minister Lange looked distinctly uncomfortable during this press conference and was not his usual articulate self in defending Douglas's new proposals. Unbeknown to most of us at the time, Longy was having a romantic liaison with a left-wing university lecturer violently opposed to Douglas's policies. He was also being hounded in the press for having abandoned his socialist principles and surrendered to the interests of big business. A month after the press conference, Douglas went overseas. Big mistake. Prime Minister Longy called a press conference of his own and unilaterally announced that the entire package that Douglas had proposed was cancelled forthwith. Douglas returned from overseas, tried to put a brave face on things. Months of confusion followed before Longy finally sacked Douglas from the cabinet. Confusion then turned to paralysis. In August of 1989, Longy himself resigned. Now, by August of 1989, the aforementioned Lindsay Perigo had long since left radio and established himself as a television current affairs interviewer. He was still insane, and in August of 1989 was attending yet another of those alien cult gatherings in San Diego. And he was rung up by his employers to be told that the Prime Minister had resigned and that he would have to hurry home and do all the appropriate television interviews. Perigo's response was, "Tell the bloody Prime Minister he'll just have to resign without me." And he stayed at the Thomas Jefferson Conference, where, as it happens, a comparable sort of drama was being played out in the upper echelons of objectivism, but enough of that. In 1990, the Labour government was thrown out resoundingly, and the National Party, which by now had dislodged Muldoon from its leadership and gone some way to rediscovering its belief in the free market and the freedom of the individual, was returned to power. The new national government did what Roger Douglas had been unable to do. Its finance minister, Ruth Richardson, courageously picked up where Roger Douglas had left off. They abolished compulsory unionism, deregulated the labour market, slashed welfare payments, and chipped away relentlessly at government expenditure. The country was on the move again, but the price for the government was electoral unpopularity. When National was re-elected by a mere whisker in 1993, the Prime Minister, Jim Bolger, like David Longy before him, lost his nerve, sacked Ruth Richardson, and replaced her with a long-time friend and one-time ardent Muldoon supporter by the name of Bill Birch. Now, the appalling irony here is that Bill Birch is now presiding over an economy that is at last enjoying the fruits of the Douglas-Richardson reforms. Annual economic growth stands at 6%, its highest level in decades. Inflation is at its lowest level in decades. Unemployment is plummeting. The government's budget is in surplus. Government expenditure as a percentage of gross national product has come down from 41% under Muldoon to around 32% now, and still falling. Public debt has been significantly reduced. Publications like the Wall Street Journal and The Economist regularly sing New Zealand's praises for implementing a privatisation deregulation program which the rest of the world should emulate. But all in the garden is not rosy. I said at the outset that New Zealand is a nation reformed by Hayekians, run by pragmatists, populated by socialists. Now, by this last, I mean that many New Zealanders, probably a majority, are still imbued with the mindset that the world owes them a living and that it's the government's job to make them prosperous and happy. In spite of the obvious success of the economic reforms, there is a significant groundswell of public opinion that wants to overturn them, that holds their very success, indeed, against them. Now, by pragmatists in charge of the government, I don't mean to say that our politicians are informed devotees of William James or John Dewey. I mean they are devotees of the proposition that politics is the art of the possible and that the realm of the possible alters dramatically as election day draws near.